Good afternoon. This is the fourth edition of the Scott Ritter Show. The last three episodes, we were fortunate to have the presence of just outstanding guests, and I believe that the interaction between myself and the guests, provided a lot of valuable insight and information on what's going on in Ukraine vis-a-vis the ongoing special military operation. Today, we're going to try something a little bit different. As I think you would have had to have been asleep for the last week not to know that there's been a significant development regarding the special military operation in Ukraine. Around September 1st, the Ukrainian armed forces initiated a major counteroffensive, first striking in the vicinity of Kherson, and then later opening up a second major counteroffensive in the vicinity of Kharkov. This has led to some very dramatic outcomes that have fundamentally altered the operational picture in the Ukrainian theater, at least from my point of view. So what I'm going to do right now is put on my former intelligence officer's hat and provide a breakdown of what's transpired in the past week from the standpoint of maybe how an American analyst would examine this. I think the first thing I would note is that the fundamental military balance of power has been altered significantly in the favor of Ukraine over the course of the summer. Now, this might not have been readily noticed by the average analyst, but I think it's clear when one takes a look at the battles that have been fought that Russia had defeated the Ukrainian army by early summer. The equipment that the Ukrainian army possessed at the beginning of the special military operation had largely been destroyed or damaged or captured, and the fundamental structures of the Ukrainian army had been defeated by the Russians. It was 100% advantage Russia going into the summer. When Russia stopped its phase one operations in around March 25th of this year and moved into phase two, they also, I believe, fundamentally changed the doctrinal approach to how they were prosecuting this conflict. They were confronting a new reality in the Donbass region, not a new reality to anybody who's been following it, but for 8 years, the Ukrainian armed forces had been able to entrench themselves in Donetsk and Lugansk. And these defensive lines, especially opposite the city of Donetsk, are extensive. Multiple layers, heavily reinforced, supporting positions. It's just a very difficult military problem. And it's not one that is conducive to normal doctrinal solutions unless the attacking side is willing to sacrifice a lot of lives. And one of the clear lessons at the end of phase one was that Russia, was seeking to prevail militarily, but in a manner which reduced Russian casualties, increased Ukrainian casualties. And in the Donbass, in the fighting there, Russia succeeded in doing just this. There were some impressive victories. The Battle of Mariupol was a decisive Russian victory. The defeat of the Azov regiment when they dug themselves in the Avza steel plant, again, decisive. The capture of Severodonetsk, another decisive Russian victory. And Russia is in the process of scoring additional victories on that frontage. But in doing so, Russia had to strip away artillery resources from other fronts to maximize the firepower available to the forces that were confronting the Ukrainian forces that were dug in Donetsk. And this, I think, was ultimately part of their eventual undoing. While Russia was doing this, while Russia was changing its doctrinal approach, the Ukrainian army was buying time. They were throwing into the front lines poorly trained territorial defense units, reservists, and withdrawing from the battlefield their more experienced, better trained combat veterans who were dispatched to training locations in the West Ukraine or outside of Ukraine in NATO nations like Poland, Germany, France, Great Britain. where they received specialized training, both in terms of new equipment that NATO was providing, part of a $53 billion arms or aid package that the United States was funding, on top of billions of dollars of weaponry provided by NATO and European members to Ukraine. And the end result was that by July, early August, the Ukrainian army stopped being an army that was trained and equipped by NATO and actually became a NATO army that was manned by Ukrainians. And when I say manned by Ukrainians, I mean the fighting soldiers at the front line are primarily Ukrainians. Yes, there's a significant number of foreign volunteers, the so-called International Legion, are also present. We'll talk about that in a second. But the Ukrainian army doesn't do the operational planning anymore. This is done in conjunction with NATO. The Ukrainian army doesn't oversee the logistical planning. This is done in conjunction with NATO. NATO provides the intelligence that's used by the Ukrainians. And then the Ukrainian military is now organized and has new doctrine, new tactics that they didn't have prior to this. So it's a NATO army. And I don't think Russia made the adjustment. I think Russia got complacent. Now, when the Ukrainians initiated their offensive operations against Kherson, Russian standard defensive doctrine kicked in, and the Ukrainians were repulsed with firepower. That's primarily how the Russians doctrinally deal with attacks. They use artillery fire as a mobile defensive asset to lure the enemy into pre-planned so-called fire kettles or fire cauldrons, where they can be dealt with through artillery. And any enemy that comes in will be dealt with by the forces. If they penetrate, there's immediate reserves that counterattack and push them back. And the Russians performed flawlessly in Kherson. The Ukrainians were handed a significant defeat, and they lost thousands of dead and many thousands of wounded, and hundreds of items of equipment were destroyed. The Russians did doctrinally respond by shifting strategic reserves toward the Kherson front to deal with this. And in doing so, I believe they weakened the northern front, Kharkov. But Kharkov was already fundamentally weakened. I mean, when the Ukrainians opened up their offensive, the place that they struck, a frontline position, was manned by special police battalions. These aren't frontline combat troops. These are troops that are designed to take on terrorism, organized crime. They are very capable, especially in a low-intensity infantry-on-infantry fight. But they're not designed to carry out a defense against a heavily armored opponent coming at you. Furthermore, where was the artillery? Where were the fire cauldrons? The Ukrainians rapidly advanced through any potential kill zone using new tactics. Instead of dismounted infantry, the infantry stayed on their armored vehicles, rapidly pushed through any potential kill zone, and started penetrating into the Russian rear. There was no defense in depth. Doctrinally, Russia would have a defense in depth. There was no immediate counterattack by operational reserves earmarked for this purpose. So the Iranian or the Ukrainian counteroffensive wasn't pinched off, wasn't blocked. It proceeded to run rampant in the Russian rear area, creating an untenable situation that prompted the Russians to rapidly withdraw. I won't call it a panicked retreat. I won't disgrace the Russians to that extent, the Russian servicemen, but it was a rapid withdrawal, an unplanned withdrawal from my perspective, where the Russians were simply trying to get out of what could have become a giant cauldron where the Ukrainians trapped the Russians. And in doing so, the Russians abandoned significant ammunition dumps, equipment, etc. The one thing that can be said about the Russian withdrawal is that they preserved Russian life. Ukrainians continued to suffer very heavy casualties, whereas the Russian casualties were minimal, especially given the situation that they found themselves in. Russia appears to have stabilized the northern front on a new defensive position. It's still being heavily attacked by the Ukrainians. There's no guarantee of the outcome, but it appears for a moment that there is a modicum of stability in the front. How did this happen? First of all, in the north, Russia had two of their prime military formations: the 1st Guards Tank Army and the 20th Combined Arms Army. These are two units with a tremendous history. They performed well in World War II. They were frontline units during the Cold War. They had been deactivated after the Cold War, were brought back in 2016 as part of the new Russian army with a focus of bringing mobile warfare capabilities against any potential NATO threat. These units should know doctrinally how to defend and how to attack. We didn't see any of that. And so that's one of the big questions is what happened to these two premier forces? Why aren't they the standard that one would expect of units of this capability? Why weren't they on the front lines? Why were special police on the front lines? Why didn't they have a defense in depth? Where was the artillery? Where was air power? These are all very difficult questions that need to be asked as Russia goes forward. The other issue is an intelligence issue. Why didn't Russia pick up? I mean, if I, as an observer from thousands of miles away, was able to detect this transformation of the Ukrainian military into a NATO military, to anticipate that this military would have a significant impact on the battlefield, and then to watch as this new Ukrainian/NATO army built up its power near the front lines, I would imagine that the Russian military, with its capable intelligence services, was able to do the same thing. One has to ask the question, did Russia detect this buildup? If so, what reports were generated? Who received these reports? How were these reports sent up to higher command? What did higher command do? Just a basic first brush of this, I would say that what happened to Russia in the Kharkov region recently is an intelligence failure on the scope and scale of what happened to Israel in the 1973 Yom Kippur War, where they were unable to adequately predict the Egyptian assault across the Suez Canal. Now, in the 1973 Yom Kippur War, Israel reacted, adapted, and eventually pushed the Egyptians back and achieved victory. I believe that's the same outcome we're going to get with Russia. I don't view the Russians as defeated, but I do view the Russians as having lost a battle they didn't need to lose. And this, there's a lot of questions that need to be raised. Another question that has to come up is, with this new reality, this new NATO army, is the current force structure of the special military operation sufficient to the task? There's three tasks that are presented according to the Russian civilian leadership and high command. First and foremost is the liberation of Donbass. While the Lugansk People's Republic has been completely liberated, there's still about 20% of the Donetsk People's Republic that's occupied by Ukrainian forces. A lot of heavy fighting left. So that hasn't been done. The Russian military claims that part of the reason or part of the outcome of this redistribution of forces in Kharkov, to be polite, is that Russian resources, military resources, will now be made available that can be applied to the Donetsk fighting. Okay, but then what? Let's assume that Russia completes its task of liberating Donetsk. How does Russia proceed with demilitarization? The Russians themselves have said that demilitarization entails the dismantling of all NATO infrastructure, NATO influence on the Ukrainian military. I think it's clear now that the Ukrainian military is a NATO military. It's equipped, it's organized, its operations are coordinated with NATO. So demilitarization means the total defeat of the Ukrainian military. The total defeat of the Ukrainian military. Can 200,000 Russian soldiers, no matter how bravely they fight, no matter how well they're led, are they capable of accomplishing this task? The professional answer is no, they're not. They can defend the Donbass, they can defend Kherson, they can defend the land bridge between Crimea and the Donbass, but they won't be able to demilitarize Ukraine. And as a result, what would happen would be a long-term stalemate where Ukrainians continue to shell civilian infrastructure, cities, towns in the Donbass, in Kherson. Crimea would continue to be at risk from Ukrainian attack. And I don't believe there's a Russian leader, civilian or military, who would find that outcome acceptable. The other objective is denazification. And I think it's clear right now, and I'm sorry to have to say this, but this Kharkov retreat was a massive betrayal of the citizens of the Kharkov Oblast who had lived under Russian um, governance while the Russian military was present. While Russia did make an effort to withdraw citizens into Russia and protect them, thousands of pro-Russian Ukrainians were left behind. And what's happening to them right now is a total travesty. If you want evidence of the evil nature of the Ukrainian government, if you want evidence of the Bandera roots of the nationalist units, one only needs to take a look at what's the fate that's being dealt out to these Russian loyalists who remained in what is now Ukrainian-controlled territory. It's tragic. It's horrible. It's also a condemnation of Russian behavior. This should never have been allowed to happen. But the Banderists are real. Stepan Bandera, the Ukrainian nationalist who fought alongside Adolf Hitler, whose troops participated in the murder of tens of thousands of Jews, whose forces slaughtered hundreds of thousands of Poles, hundreds of thousands of Russians, is today the national hero of Ukraine. And many of the right-wing nationalist forces swear allegiance to him. And the political parties that provide the ideology that motivates these military forces still function. They have tremendous influence over Ukraine today. So denazification means not just the elimination of military units, not just the elimination of political parties, but a complete transformation of the government of Ukraine. Any government that tolerates the crimes that are being perpetrated against Russian nationals and Russian speakers in Ukraine today can no longer be allowed to exist, I believe, under the definition of what denazification is. This implies that the Russians are going to have to project military power in a meaningful fashion throughout the depth of Ukraine to accomplish this task. Can they do it with 200,000 troops? Again, my assessment is no, not even close. So what is the solution? I think we have to also understand that war is really politics by other means. And if we simply look at the battlefield, we can't really see the solution because we're focused in on only one aspect of the problem. This conflict, when it began, wasn't just a military conflict, it was an economic conflict. It was a geopolitical conflict. The United States and Europe and the G7 and their allies around the world sought to crush the Russian economy by imposing massive sanctions. And when I say crush the Russian economy, I mean crush the Russian people. And I think every Russian needs to understand that this wasn't some abstract sanctioning of Russian leadership. This was sanctioning, deliberately targeting the Russian people, seeking to bring harm to the Russian people, with the goal of creating so much pain and suffering that the Russian people would rise up and overthrow the government of President Vladimir Putin. So it's regime change. That's the objective of the United States and its allies. Russia has responded, in my opinion, brilliantly. They predicted much of what was happening. They had plans in place. Russia has successfully delinked itself from the West. Russia is managing the global energy security issues to their benefit, bringing dire times ahead for Europe, the United States, and other nations participating in the sanctioning of Russian energy. Meanwhile, while opening up new markets which allow Russia's economy to continue to function and indeed in certain areas thrive. Russia's redefining global geopolitical alliances. Its relationship with China is very secure. It's developing and improving relationships with India and other nations. So, you know, Russia's doing quite well at a time when Europe's getting ready to feel the brunt of the impact of their sanctioning policy. It appears that the energy security situation for Europe is dire. Industries are shutting down as energy prices become unaffordable. There's not sufficient quantities available to adequately heat and power Europe through the winter. If it's a cold winter, Europe's going to suffer greatly. And when people suffer, especially in a democracy, they tend to rise up and hold to account those who brought the suffering by their policies. And this means that it's very likely that the majority of the politicians that currently rule in Europe today may not be here come springtime. And this is to Russia's advantage. This is something that I believe the Russian government is counting on. The last thing the Russian government needs to do is cripple itself by engaging in a general mobilization that will have tremendous negative impact on the Russian economy. So I don't think that general mobilization at this time is warranted. it would do more harm than good. But how do you generate the forces? We know that there's an ongoing effort to recruit and train volunteers. There's a training facility in Chechnya run by Chechen Special Forces that is training nationalist units. I'm not talking about, Chechen forces, although they're trained there. I'm talking about, for instance, Ukrainians from the liberated territories in Kherson, et cetera, who are being organized into combat units. Other volunteers from across Russia are being brought in and trained. And this is a great help. But there's probably going to need to be more. I think that Russia can't realistically think of accomplishing its stated objectives unless it can generate forces of around 300 to 400,000 troops. And this is a challenge for the Russian government. Fortunately for Russia, they're going to be reinforced by two generals very soon. One is General Mudd. The muddy season is about to come in, which is going to, in effect, freeze military operations all along the front. And I believe Russia will be able to take advantage of this time to further regroup, further reorganize, and further prepare for what's to come. But General Mudd works both ways. The Ukrainians are going to be able to do the same thing. So Russia's going to have to find a way to continue to disrupt the Ukrainians during the muddy season. This means heavier emphasis on air power. The next ally is General Winter. And here, General Winter is going to help on two fronts. One, on the military battlefield. If Russia has prepared adequately, Russia should be able to resume the offensive and hopefully exploit its superiority and maneuver warfare to its advantage on the battlefield and inflict defeat on the Ukrainians. But also, General Winter is going to bring about some very serious difficulties for the people of Europe and the people of Ukraine. And governments have a hard time sustaining warfare when they've lost the support of the people. I think General Winter is going to suck the support that currently exists in Europe for this conflict out of the European population. And again, I think come springtime, we're going to see a radically transformed reality, one where Russia's military is supreme and Russia continues to dominate geopolitically, both in the political sphere and the economic sphere. And so, Russia will win, but it's not going to be easy. And here's the important part. It's not guaranteed. If Russia sits back and does nothing, makes no alterations, fails to adapt, then they're looking at a stalemate. And even though that doesn't mean a Russian defeat, in a situation like that, Ukraine wins by not losing. So a stalemate is a strategic Russian loss. Stalemate does not allow Russia to accomplish its larger strategic objective of being able to convince Europe to adapt a new European security framework along the lines that the Russian government proposed in December of 2021. A stalemate means that Russia is going to be locked into a forever conflict that will drain public support for the war, drain the Russian economy, and all the while allow Ukraine to strengthen, making it virtually impossible for Russia to inflict a military defeat. So stalemate is not an option. Total defeat of Ukraine is the only option, and Russia is not currently organized, equipped, or sufficiently manned in the Ukrainian theater of operations, for my opinion, to accomplish that objective. So there it is. That's my intelligence briefing for this week. My name's Scott Ritter, and remember, knowledge is power.